Eric Amoateng was elected to Ghana's parliament in 2004 with nearly half the votes in his constituency. His supporters called him a miracle worker. He had built streets, funded schools, and installed lighting systems in towns where the government had failed to deliver basic services. 2 years into his term, he renounced his traditional title as a chief to comply with parliamentary rules. He donated pickup trucks to secure his party's nomination. He carried a university degree in religion and had worked as a teacher. On paper, he looked like a model representative. But in November 2005, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents arrested him at a storage facility in Staten Island. Inside the unit were 7 crates of decorative pottery shipped from Dubai. Hidden in false bottoms were 136 pounds of heroin worth over $6 million on American streets. The question investigators in both countries struggled to answer was not whether Amoateng had committed the crime. The evidence was overwhelming, but how a sitting member of parliament had managed to operate an international trafficking network while holding public office. The answer revealed something darker than individual corruption. It exposed a system where criminal wealth could purchase not just influence, but institutional protection that lasted years after the crime was proven. Amoateng was born on February 19, 1953 in Ghana. His early path followed the typical trajectory of rural educators in the region. He attended Nkoranza Anglican School and later enrolled at Nkoranza Training College, qualifying as a teacher in 1973. The credential gave him standing in a community where formal education remained relatively scarce. He continued his studies at the University of Ghana, earning a diploma and eventually a Bachelor of Arts in Religion. These qualifications allowed him to move between secular and traditional structures of authority. He understood how both systems worked and how they could be leveraged. The teaching profession in Ghana during this period occupied a respected middle ground in the social hierarchy. Teachers were among the few professionals in rural areas who had regular contact with government systems and formal institutions. They understood bureaucratic processes and could navigate administrative requirements that confounded others. Amoateng's educational background gave him literacy in both traditional customs and modern governance structures. This dual fluency would become essential to his later operations. He could speak the language of chiefs and elders while also understanding how ministries, procurement processes, and political parties functioned. The elevation that transformed his social position came when he was installed as chief of Amoma, a town in the Kintampo South district of the Brong-Ahafo region. He took the title Nana Amoateng Amoateng. In Ghana, chieftaincy is not ceremonial decoration. It functions as a parallel governance structure with deep roots in local decision-making. Chiefs command loyalty that transcends party politics. They control access to land, mediate disputes, and serve as cultural anchors. The position gave Amoateng a platform from which he could mobilize resources and shape opinion. It was during this period that his spending patterns began to raise questions among those who paid attention. Traditional authority in Ghana operates through complex networks of obligation and reciprocity. A chief is expected to provide for his people, to be generous, to settle conflicts, and to represent the community's interests to external authorities. These expectations create opportunities for ambitious individuals. A chief who can deliver material benefits, jobs, infrastructure, financial assistance, builds a base of support that is both emotional and transactional. People follow leaders who improve their circumstances. Amoateng understood this dynamic and exploited it systematically. His official employment was as a marketing manager for Koje, a company that distributed school supplies. The salary from such a position would have been modest by any standard. Marketing managers in Ghana's private sector during the 1990s and early 2000s earned comfortable but not extravagant incomes. The job involved managing relationships with schools and educational institutions, coordinating deliveries, and handling basic sales operations. It was respectable work, but it did not generate the kind of wealth that Amoateng was displaying. Yet Amoateng was financing infrastructure projects that should have been the responsibility of district governments. He paid for the construction of 8 streets in Busonia and installed drainage systems. He funded schools and street lighting. These were not small gestures. They were systematic interventions that filled the vacuum left by state neglect. The scale of his spending became impossible to ignore. Street construction in rural Ghana involves significant costs: labor, materials, engineering oversight, and ongoing maintenance. Drainage systems require excavation, pipe installation, and coordination with local planning authorities. School buildings need land, construction permits, materials, furniture, and staffing arrangements. Street lighting requires electrical infrastructure, poles, fixtures, and arrangements with power providers. Each of these projects represented expenditures in the tens of thousands of cedis. Together, they amounted to investments that would have exhausted the lifetime savings of a successful professional. Yet Amoateng was funding multiple projects simultaneously while maintaining a lifestyle that included luxury vehicles and expensive travel. Residents who had waited years for basic services saw them materialize under Amoateng's patronage. The impact was both material and psychological. He became associated with progress in areas where progress had stalled. District assemblies had failed to deliver. Central government ministries had neglected the region. Local representatives had made promises and then disappeared, but Amoateng delivered. His projects were visible, tangible, and immediate. People could walk on streets he had paved. Children attended schools he had funded. Families benefited from lighting systems he had installed. The gratitude this generated was profound and durable. His community began referring to him as a magician. The term carried two meanings. Amoateng was known for performing magic tricks and special antics that entertained audiences. He would appear at community events and perform sleight-of-hand routines, make objects disappear, and execute tricks that delighted children and adults alike. These performances were not merely entertainment. They reinforced the perception that Amoateng possessed unusual abilities, that he could make things happen through means that others could not understand or replicate. But the deeper connotation was his apparent ability to produce money from nowhere. People marveled at the scale of his generosity without understanding its source. This ambiguity worked in his favor. In environments where formal economies offer limited opportunity, sudden wealth can be interpreted as cleverness rather than crime. Ghana's economy in the 1990s and early 2000s provided few pathways to rapid wealth accumulation for those outside elite circles. The formal sector offered limited high-paying jobs. Small businesses operated on thin margins. Agriculture provided subsistence but rarely surplus. Against this backdrop, individuals who suddenly displayed significant wealth were often assumed to have found some clever loophole, some business opportunity that others had missed, or some connection to foreign markets that allowed them to profit in ways that domestic employment did not. Skepticism existed, but it was often overwhelmed by the benefits that flowed from the patron's generosity. Amoateng cultivated this perception deliberately. He made himself indispensable. Families received help with medical expenses when illness struck and hospitals demanded payment. Students got school fees when families could not afford tuition. Events received sponsorship that allowed communities to celebrate festivals and ceremonies with dignity. The dependency he created was a form of protection. Communities that rely on a patron are less likely to question his methods. To investigate Amoateng's wealth would risk losing access to resources that had become essential to everyday life. Parents whose children were in school because of his generosity were unlikely to demand accountability. Families who had received emergency assistance were invested in his continued prosperity. This model is not unique to Ghana. It appears wherever state capacity is weak and organized crime is strong. The pattern has a name in academic literature: narco-patrimonialism. The criminal actor positions himself as a provider of public goods, creating civilian shields through strategic philanthropy. The community becomes invested in his survival because his downfall would mean the loss of resources they depend on. Amoateng understood this dynamic instinctively. He built a base of support that was transactional but also emotional. People didn't just benefit from his money, they believed he cared about them. That belief would prove durable even when the truth about his activities became public. The construction of this persona required years of consistent investment. Amoateng did not become Father Christmas overnight. He built his reputation through sustained engagement with his community. He attended funerals and made donations to bereaved families. He sponsored youth football teams and provided equipment. He appeared at church functions and contributed to building funds. He participated in traditional ceremonies and fulfilled the obligations expected of a chief. Each of these actions reinforced his image as a benefactor and protector. Over time, the accumulated goodwill became a form of political capital that he could deploy when needed. Amoateng's move into formal politics was not a natural progression. It was a calculated strategy designed to secure protections that chieftaincy alone could not provide. Allegations from multiple sources suggest his primary motivation was obtaining a diplomatic passport and the immunity that comes with parliamentary status. These tools would reduce the risk of interdiction when moving across international borders. For someone coordinating drug shipments, they were valuable assets. Traditional authority offered many advantages, but it had limitations. A chief could influence local affairs but had no formal standing in national government. A chief could mobilize community support but could not access the legal protections afforded to members of parliament. Most critically, a chief could not obtain the travel documents that would facilitate international movement with reduced scrutiny. Diplomatic passports are issued to individuals representing the state in official capacities. Members of parliament qualify for these documents because they are considered state officials. The passport provides expedited processing at immigration checkpoints and, in some contexts, reduced customs scrutiny. For someone moving narcotics across borders, these advantages were significant. Parliamentary immunity in Ghana operates under Article 117 of the Constitution. It provides that members of parliament cannot be prosecuted for statements made in the course of parliamentary proceedings. This immunity is designed to protect free speech and robust debate in the legislature. However, the perception, accurate or not, existed that parliamentarians enjoyed broader protections. They were harder to investigate because police and prosecutors hesitated to target elected officials without overwhelming evidence. They had access to legal resources through their party structures. They could use their platform to shape public narratives about investigations. These protections were informal but real. A member of parliament occupied a different legal and political space than an ordinary citizen, even an ordinary chief. His first attempt to enter parliament came in 2000 when he sought the new Patriotic Party nomination for the Nkoranza constituency. He was unsuccessful. Local constituents were reportedly uneasy about the suddenness and scale of his wealth. Questions had begun circulating about where the money was coming from. Amoateng's philanthropy had made him popular, but it had also made him conspicuous. People talked. Rivals within the NPP raised concerns. The party's internal vetting process, such as it was, hesitated. Amoateng withdrew and waited. The failed 2000 bid taught him important lessons about political timing and the need to manage internal party dynamics more carefully. By 2004, circumstances had changed. The Nkoranza constituency had been split into two, creating Nkoranza North and Nkoranza South. Constituency boundary changes are routine in Ghana as population shifts and administrative considerations require periodic adjustments. But the creation of Nkoranza North provided Amoateng with a fresh opportunity. The northern constituency was his stronghold. Busunya, where he had funded extensive infrastructure, fell within its boundaries. His core supporters were concentrated there. The southern constituency, where skepticism about his wealth had been stronger, was now a separate electoral contest. Amoateng targeted the northern seat. To comply with constitutional requirements that prohibit traditional rulers from holding parliamentary office, he renounced his chieftaincy. Article 94(3) of Ghana's constitution states that a person shall not be qualified to be a member of parliament if that person is a chief or is nominated to be a chief for election as a chief. The provision reflects a deliberate attempt to maintain separation between traditional and modern governance structures, but the decision was symbolic rather than substantive. He retained his influence, and his title remained part of his public identity. People continued to refer to him as Nana. His authority within the traditional hierarchy persisted informally even after the formal renunciation. The constitutional requirement was satisfied on paper, while the practical reality remained unchanged. Securing the NPP nomination required overcoming internal resistance. Party officials who remembered the 2000 campaign remained skeptical. Some questioned whether his candidacy would create problems for the party if questions about his wealth gained traction during the general election campaign. Others worried about the optics of nominating someone whose source of income was unclear. But internal party politics in Ghana operate largely on patronage and resource mobilization. Candidates who can finance their own campaigns and contribute to party coffers have significant advantages. Amoateng addressed the skepticism with a direct financial intervention. He donated 2 new pickup trucks to the party headquarters. The gesture was substantial. Vehicles are expensive and essential assets for political parties in Ghana. They are used for transporting officials, organizing campaign events, and distributing materials. A party with more vehicles has greater operational capacity. 2 new pickup trucks represented a tangible contribution to the party's infrastructure. The donation shifted the calculation for party officials. Whatever concerns existed about Amoateng's background, his ability to resource the party was undeniable. The NPP awarded him the ticket. Internal opposition melted away once financial benefits became clear. This dynamic, resource-rich candidates overriding institutional skepticism through direct financial contribution is common in political parties where funding is scarce and candidates self-finance their campaigns. The general election in 2004 was competitive, but Amoateng's resource advantage was decisive. He received 9,144 votes, representing 48.4% of the total. His nearest rival from the National Democratic Congress received 5,402 votes, taking 28.6%. An independent candidate, Kwemafasu Ajay Prince, took 4,354 votes, representing 23%. Amoateng's margin of victory was 3,742 votes, a comfortable 22.3% lead in a 3-way race. The total valid votes cast were 18,900, a typical turnout for a rural constituency. The campaign itself showcased Amoateng's advantages. He had name recognition from years of philanthropy. He had organizational capacity through his network of supporters who had benefited from his generosity. He had financial resources to fund transportation for voters, organize rallies, distribute campaign materials, and provide refreshments at events. His opponents could not match this level of resource deployment. The NDC candidate relied on party structures and national campaign messaging. The independent candidate had even fewer resources. Amoateng dominated the ground game, the air war, and the resource battle. The outcome was never seriously in doubt once the campaign began, but the campaign was not without legal challenges. In November 2004, a citizen named Collins Antwi filed a case at the Sunyani High Court challenging Amoateng's candidacy. The petitioner cited suspicious character and lack of moral standing. The petition was vague on specifics, but it reflected concerns that had circulated privately within Nkoranza. Antwi was not a political figure. He appeared to be an ordinary citizen attempting to use the courts to block a candidacy he considered problematic. The case drew attention to reports that Amoateng had been charged with visa fraud in 2001. Details of that incident were never fully clarified in public records. The charge involved allegations that Amoateng had provided false information on a visa application to a foreign embassy. Whether the charge resulted in prosecution or how it was resolved remained unclear. The NPP's regional chairman, Nana Abiri Bohan, represented the party's interests in the matter. Abiri Bohan was a lawyer and a senior party official. His involvement signaled that the party was treating the challenge seriously and was willing to deploy legal resources to protect Amoateng's candidacy. The case was eventually withdrawn. The circumstances of the withdrawal suggested pressure rather than resolution. Collins Antwi did not publicly explain why he dropped the petition. There were no reports of settlement or compromise. The case simply disappeared from the court docket. This pattern, legal challenges that emerge and then quietly vanish, often indicates behind-the-scenes negotiations or intimidation. Whether Antwi was persuaded, compensated, or pressured remains unknown, but the effect was to clear the path for Amoateng's inauguration. Amoateng's inauguration proceeded as scheduled on January 7, 2005. He took his seat in Ghana's parliament as the representative for Nkoranza North. He had achieved the institutional position he sought. The ceremony was formal and dignified. New members took oaths of office and pledged to uphold the constitution. Amoateng joined the NPP caucus and received committee assignments. To external observers, he was simply another MP beginning his term. But to investigators who had been monitoring narcotics flows through West Africa, his election represented a troubling development. A suspected trafficker now occupied a seat in national legislature and enjoyed the protections that came with it. The timing of his entry into parliament aligned with the operational phase of his trafficking network. By 2005, the logistics for moving heroin from source countries through West Africa to North America were already in place. Amoateng's parliamentary status provided cover for travel and access. It complicated efforts by domestic law enforcement to scrutinize his activities. In Ghana's political culture, members of parliament occupy a protected status. Investigating an MP requires navigating party hierarchies and managing public perception. Law enforcement agencies are reluctant to pursue cases against sitting legislators without overwhelming evidence. The political costs of a failed investigation are high. Prosecutors face pressure to avoid targeting elected officials. These dynamics create space for corruption to flourish. Amoateng had constructed multiple layers of insulation: traditional authority, party loyalty, community dependency, and now legislative immunity. The shipment that led to Amoateng's arrest was not a lone transaction. It was part of a sustained operation that used West Africa as a transit corridor for heroin moving from source regions to consumer markets. The specific consignment intercepted by U.S. authorities contained 136 pounds of heroin, approximately 62 kilograms. Street value estimates placed it above $6 million. The volume indicated this was not amateur trafficking. It required coordination, financial backing, and established distribution channels. The scale of the operation can be understood through comparison. A single kilogram of heroin represents thousands of individual doses. At typical street purity levels and dosage amounts, 1 kilogram can be divided into roughly 10,000 individual user doses. The 62-kilogram shipment therefore represented approximately 620,000 doses. This volume far exceeds anything a street-level dealer would handle. It places Amoateng's operation firmly in the category of wholesale trafficking, moving product in bulk from international suppliers to domestic distribution networks. Profits at this level are substantial. Even with multiple layers of middlemen taking cuts, the margins on heroin trafficking make it one of the most lucrative criminal enterprises globally. The narcotics originated in regions where heroin production is concentrated. While the research packet does not specify the exact source country, the routing through Dubai provides clues. Heroin entering global markets typically originates in one of two primary zones: the Golden Crescent, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, or the Golden Triangle, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand. Dubai serves as a major transshipment hub for goods moving between Asia, Africa, and the West. Its modern port facilities, extensive air cargo infrastructure, and relatively light regulatory oversight make it attractive for both legitimate and illicit commerce. Traffickers exploit the volume of legal trade to conceal contraband within legitimate shipments. The cargo was routed through Dubai, where it was concealed within 7 crates of decorative pottery. The concealment method involved false bottoms, a technique designed to defeat visual inspection and basic scanning technology. The construction of effective false bottom containers requires skill. The hidden compartment must be large enough to hold significant quantities of narcotics, but not so large that it creates obvious discrepancies in weight or dimensions. The pottery had to look authentic. The crates needed to appear consistent with legitimate commercial shipments. Someone in the network had expertise in concealment techniques and access to craftsmen who could construct the containers without raising suspicion. Pottery was a strategic choice. Ghana has a legitimate ceramics industry, particularly in artisanal exports. The Brong-Ahafo region where Amoateng's constituency was located is known for traditional pottery production. Craftsmen produce decorative items for domestic use and for export to diaspora communities and tourist markets. Shipping pottery from the region carries no inherent suspicion. Customs officials reviewing cargo manifests would see pottery exports from Ghana as routine. The choice of cover cargo showed operational sophistication. The traffickers had selected a product that was consistent with Ghana's export profile, that could plausibly originate from Amoateng's region, and that provided sufficient volume and weight to conceal narcotics without creating obvious anomalies. For a politician whose constituency included craft producers, the cover story had surface plausibility. Amoateng could claim to be facilitating export opportunities for local artisans. He could frame the shipment as economic development, helping traditional craftsmen access international markets. If questioned about his involvement in shipping pottery, he had a ready explanation that aligned with his public persona as a community benefactor. This layering of legitimate commercial activity over illicit trafficking is a hallmark of sophisticated operations. The best cover stories are those that contain elements of truth and that align with the suspect's known activities and interests. From Dubai, the cargo was flown to London and then onward to Newark Liberty International Airport in New Jersey. The multi-leg routing served operational purposes. Each transfer point introduced another layer of bureaucratic processing, diluting the attention any single shipment might receive. Cargo moving through multiple jurisdictions passes through different customs regimes, different scanning protocols, and different levels of enforcement intensity. A shipment that originates in Dubai, transits through London, and arrives in New York has been processed by at least 3 separate customs authorities. At each point, officials are dealing with high volumes of cargo. Resources are limited. Not every container can be thoroughly inspected. Traffickers exploit these gaps, betting that the shipment will pass through multiple checkpoints without triggering the intensive inspection that would reveal contraband. London's role as a transit point is significant. The United Kingdom maintains close security cooperation with the United States. Both countries have sophisticated customs and border protection agencies, but London is also one of the world's busiest air cargo hubs. Heathrow handles millions of tons of freight annually. The volume creates opportunities for concealment. A shipment routed through London gains a degree of legitimacy. It has passed through a major Western airport with modern security infrastructure. Customs officials in Newark reviewing cargo manifests might be less suspicious of a shipment that had already transited through London than one coming directly from a source region. Customs and border officials at each stop were dealing with high volumes of cargo. Crates labeled as pottery from Ghana via Dubai and London would not automatically trigger deep inspection. The packaging was professional. The documentation appeared legitimate. Without prior intelligence, there was no obvious reason to suspect the containers held contraband. Traffickers understand that border security operates on risk assessment. Officials prioritize inspections based on origin countries, known trafficking routes, behavioral indicators, and intelligence reports. A shipment with proper documentation, plausible cover cargo, and routing through established commercial channels is less likely to receive intensive scrutiny. The system relies on targeting high-risk shipments while allowing low-risk cargo to pass with minimal inspection. Amoateng's network exploited this by creating a shipment profile that appeared low-risk. But U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the Drug Enforcement Administration already had the shipment under surveillance. The agencies had received intelligence about the cargo before it arrived in Newark. The nature of that intelligence has not been fully disclosed in public records, but the fact that agents were positioned to monitor the shipment from the moment it landed indicates advanced knowledge. Intelligence of this kind typically comes from one of several sources: human informants within trafficking networks, signals intelligence intercepting communications between traffickers, liaison relationships with foreign law enforcement agencies, or prior investigations that identified the shipping company or individuals involved in the logistics chain. The existence of advanced intelligence suggests that U.S. authorities were already aware of Amoateng or his network before this specific shipment. They may have been tracking his activities based on previous suspicious shipments, financial intelligence showing unusual money flows, or information shared by Ghanaian law enforcement. The decision to allow the shipment to proceed rather than interdicting it at the airport indicates a deliberate investigative strategy. Agents wanted to identify everyone involved in the operation, not just the individuals who sent the cargo, but also those who would receive it, transport it, store it, and distribute it. Interdicting the drugs at the airport would arrest the operation at its entry point, Allowing it to proceed enabled agents to map the entire domestic network. The surveillance operation was methodical. Agents did not interdict the cargo at the airport. Instead, they allowed the defendants to take possession and followed them to their next destination. This approach requires significant resources. Surveillance teams must have enough personnel to maintain continuous observation without being detected. They need vehicles, communication equipment, and coordination with local law enforcement. The risk is that the targets will discover the surveillance and either flee or dispose of evidence. But the payoff is a complete picture of the operation and evidence that demonstrates possession and intent beyond any reasonable doubt. On November 11, 2005, Eric Amoateng and an accomplice named Heroin Ajay arrived at John F. Kennedy International Airport to collect the 7 crates. They used a black van to transport the boxes from JFK to Staten Island. Surveillance teams tracked the vehicle as it made its way through New York City traffic. The van entered the premises of American Self-Storage at 330 Tompkins Avenue in Staten Island. The cargo was placed in Unit 3054. Records showed the unit was registered to an individual named Gamely Quino. Heroin Ajay was listed as an authorized user. This administrative detail later became evidence of conspiracy. Multiple parties were involved in securing and accessing the storage location. The use of a storage facility was tactically sound. Bringing the heroin directly to a residence or business would create unnecessary risk. If law enforcement were monitoring, the location would be compromised. By using a storage unit registered to a third party with a J listed as authorized user, the network created a buffer. The unit provided a secure location where the cargo could be inspected away from public view. If the storage facility were raided, the registration to Quino rather than Amoateng or Ajay provided a degree of deniability. Storage facilities also offer operational advantages: 24-hour access, private units, minimal staff oversight, and the ability to come and go without attracting attention. Many facilities have limited surveillance and security personnel who rarely question what customers store. The defendants did not remain with the cargo. They left the facility after depositing the crates. This behavior is consistent with standard trafficking protocols. After receiving a shipment, experienced traffickers allow time to pass before inspecting it. This cooling-off period serves 2 purposes. It creates distance from the moment of possession, reducing exposure if law enforcement is monitoring. It also allows time to assess whether the shipment has attracted attention. If police were preparing to raid, waiting a day before returning gives them time to show their hand. If nothing happens, the traffickers can return with greater confidence. The surveillance continued. On November 12, 2005, Amoateng and Ajay returned to the storage unit. This second visit suggested they were conducting an inspection or preparing for distribution. They would have needed to verify that the heroin had arrived intact, that the concealment had not been compromised, and that the quantity matched expectations. This inspection phase would involve opening the crates, extracting the narcotics from the false bottoms, weighing and testing the product, and repackaging it for distribution. It was at this point that ICE agents moved in to execute the arrest. The timing was deliberate. The defendants were caught in the act of handling the contraband. There was no ambiguity about possession or intent. At the time of his arrest, Amoateng was carrying $9,000 in cash. His explanation was that the money was intended for the purchase of wristwatches he planned to resell in Ghana. This type of justification is common among high-level traffickers. Liquid capital raises questions. Law enforcement officers routinely ask individuals found with large sums of cash to explain its source and purpose. Defendants prepare plausible cover stories to explain why they carry large sums. The watch resale narrative was not credible under scrutiny. $9,000 is a substantial amount for a consumer purchase, but it is also exactly the kind of amount that appears in trafficking operations: payment for services, reimbursement for expenses, or working capital for the next transaction. The amount was also just below $10,000, the threshold that triggers automatic currency transaction reporting in the United States. Structuring transactions to avoid reporting requirements is itself a federal crime. Whether the specific amount was chosen deliberately to avoid triggering reporting requirements or was simply the amount Amoateng happened to have is unclear. But the presence of nearly $10,000 in cash, combined with his presence at a storage unit containing 136 pounds of heroin, undermined any innocent explanation. The defense strategy was not to prove innocence. The facts made that impossible, but to introduce doubt and delay consequences. Amoateng's legal defense began with an assertion that would define the early phase of the case. His attorneys argued he was protected by diplomatic immunity. The claim rested on his status as a member of parliament in Ghana. The defense contended that his travel to the United States fell under official state business, and that his parliamentary position afforded him protections equivalent to those granted to diplomats. If accepted, this argument would have required U.S. authorities to release him and return him to Ghana without prosecution. The diplomatic immunity defense was legally weak but strategically understandable. It was one of the few defenses that could result in dismissal rather than merely reduction of charges. Diplomatic immunity is governed by the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, which Ghana and the United States are both party to. The convention provides that diplomatic agents are immune from criminal jurisdiction of the receiving state, but the immunity applies only to official diplomatic personnel and only for acts performed in the course of official duties. Members of Parliament are not automatically considered diplomatic agents unless they are traveling in an official capacity as part of a diplomatic mission. U.S. federal law recognizes functional immunity for foreign officials performing governmental functions, but drug trafficking does not qualify as a governmental function under any interpretation. Even heads of state can be prosecuted for international crimes committed outside their official duties. The defense team would have known this, but the claim served several purposes. It delayed proceedings while courts considered the argument. It generated media attention in Ghana that portrayed Amoateng as a victim of American overreach. It created a rallying point for supporters who could claim he was being unfairly targeted, and it preserved all other defense options if the immunity claim was rejected. The U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of New York rejected the claim. The ruling was unambiguous. Judges determined that Amoateng's travel was not for official parliamentary duties. Nothing in the record supported the assertion that he was in New York on behalf of the Ghanaian government. He had not been part of any parliamentary delegation. He had not attended official meetings or functions. He had not notified U.S. authorities of any official visit. His activities in New York, collecting heroin from an airport and transporting it to a storage facility, had no connection to legislative duties. The crimes he was charged with, conspiracy to distribute heroin, fell entirely outside any protected diplomatic function. Even if parliamentary immunity existed under Ghanaian law, it did not extend to criminal acts committed in foreign jurisdictions, particularly acts involving international drug trafficking. The court's decision closed off the primary avenue of escape Amoateng's defense team had pursued. Parliamentary immunity is designed to protect elected officials from harassment and to ensure they can perform their duties without fear of politically motivated prosecution. It is not a shield for criminal activity unrelated to official functions. The U.S. courts applied this principle strictly. With immunity denied, the case moved into standard criminal proceedings. Both Amoateng and Amoateng initially entered pleas of not guilty. The not guilty plea is standard practice in federal criminal cases. It preserves all defense options and does not prejudice later negotiations. Most federal defendants eventually plead guilty after reviewing the evidence and assessing their chances at trial. But entering a not guilty plea initially creates space for defense attorneys to review discovery, file motions, and negotiate with prosecutors. The prosecution's case was strong. Physical evidence included the heroin itself, surveillance footage showing the defendants taking possession of the crates, and records linking them to the storage unit. The DEA and ICE had documented the operation thoroughly. Agents had photographs, video recordings, and logistical records showing the chain of custody from the airport to the storage facility. Testimonial evidence would come from agents who conducted the surveillance and forensic experts who analyzed the heroin and the concealment methods. Chemical analysis confirmed the substance was heroin and established its purity level, which affects sentencing calculations. The concealment technique, false bottoms and pottery crates, demonstrated sophistication and intent to evade detection. The defense had limited options for challenging the factual basis of the charges. The surveillance evidence was clear. The heroin was real. The defendant's presence at the storage facility was documented. There were no credible claims of mistaken identity, unlawful search, or entrapment. The evidence formed a coherent narrative that would be difficult to rebut at trial. Defense attorneys in this position typically focus on sentencing mitigation rather than contesting guilt. They look for ways to reduce exposure through cooperation, acceptance of responsibility, or establishing mitigating circumstances. Amoateng changed his plea to guilty. The decision reflected a calculation about sentencing exposure. Federal sentencing guidelines for drug crimes are based primarily on the quantity of drugs involved. For 62 kilograms of heroin, the base offense level is extremely high. Ajay faced a mandatory minimum sentence under federal drug laws. By pleading guilty and cooperating with prosecutors, he could potentially reduce his sentence through several mechanisms. Acceptance of responsibility, which provides a 2- or 3-level reduction in the sentencing guidelines. Substantial assistance to authorities, which allows judges to depart below mandatory minimums, and avoiding the additional exposure that comes from losing at trial. His cooperation also strengthened the case against Amoateng. Ajay could testify about the operational details of the shipment, who arranged it, who financed it, who was supposed to receive the heroin once it was distributed. A co-defendant's testimony is powerful evidence in conspiracy cases because it provides insider knowledge that external surveillance cannot capture. Ajay could describe conversations with Amoateng, explain how they came to be at the storage facility, and detail Amoateng's role in the broader trafficking network. This testimony would be devastating at trial. Even if defense attorneys challenged Ajay's credibility by pointing to his own guilt and his incentive to cooperate, juries typically give significant weight to co-conspirator testimony, especially when it is corroborated by physical evidence. Amoateng held out longer. For over a year, his attorneys pursued procedural challenges and negotiated with prosecutors. They filed motions challenging various aspects of the case. They sought to suppress evidence, arguing that surveillance techniques were improper or that searches violated Fourth Amendment protections. These motions were largely unsuccessful. Federal courts give law enforcement significant latitude in drug trafficking investigations, particularly when agents are conducting surveillance in public spaces or when defendants are observed taking possession of contraband. The motions served primarily to delay proceedings and to explore every possible defense avenue. During this period, defense attorneys were also negotiating with prosecutors about potential plea agreements. These negotiations involve complex calculations. Prosecutors want to secure convictions without the expense and uncertainty of trial. They are willing to make concessions, dismissing certain charges, recommending lower sentences, or agreeing not to pursue additional charges, in exchange for guilty pleas that save resources and guarantee convictions. Defense attorneys evaluate whether the concessions offered are sufficient to justify giving up the right to trial. They assess the strength of the prosecution's case, the likelihood of conviction, the sentencing exposure at trial versus through plea agreement, and the client's willingness to accept responsibility. But the evidence was overwhelming and the legal landscape was unfavorable. Federal drug prosecutions have conviction rates above 95%. Judges rarely acquit defendants when physical evidence of narcotics possession is clear. The quantity of heroin involved meant that even with a plea agreement, Amoateng faced significant prison time. On March 19, 2007, Amoateng changed his plea to guilty. The decision was pragmatic. A trial would have resulted in conviction with near certainty. By pleading guilty, he could avoid the additional exposure that comes with losing at trial. Federal sentencing guidelines reward acceptance of responsibility. Defendants who plead guilty typically receive lighter sentences than those who go to trial and are convicted. The reduction can be substantial, several years of additional prison time. The sentencing hearing took place on December 12, 2007. Honorable Judge David G. Trager presided. Federal sentencing hearings involved detailed presentations from both sides. Prosecutors present aggravating factors: the quantity of drugs, the defendant's role in the conspiracy, any prior criminal history, and the harm caused by the offense. Defense attorneys present mitigating factors: the defendant's personal history, family circumstances, acceptance of responsibility, cooperation with authorities, and any factors that might explain or contextualize the criminal conduct. The judge reviews a pre-sentence investigation report prepared by probation officers that includes biographical information, criminal history, and sentencing guideline calculations. The court sentenced Eric Amoateng to 120 months, 10 years in federal prison. The sentence also included 5 years of supervised release following his incarceration. This meant that after completing his prison term, Amoateng would remain under the jurisdiction of U.S. probation authorities for an additional 5 years. Any violation during that period could result in reincarceration. The supervised release provision is standard in federal drug cases. It reflects the court's recognition that trafficking networks often persist beyond individual arrests and that defendants may remain involved in criminal activity after release. Supervised release conditions typically include drug testing, travel restrictions, employment requirements, and prohibition on associating with known criminals. News of Amoateng's arrest in November 2005 created an immediate political crisis in Ghana. A sitting member of parliament from the ruling New Patriotic Party had been detained in the United States on drug trafficking charges. The evidence was public. The charges were serious. The international embarrassment was acute. Yet the NPP's response was defined not by accountability but by delay and deflection. The party's majority in parliament became a tool for protecting Amoateng rather than addressing the scandal he represented. The initial reaction from party officials was defensive. Senior NPP figures framed the arrest as premature and insisted on presumption of innocence. This position was legally correct. Amoateng had been arrested but not yet convicted, but it obscured the political and ethical questions his arrest raised. How had a suspected trafficker secured the party nomination? Had anyone in the party leadership known about his activities? What due diligence had been conducted before awarding him the parliamentary ticket? These questions went unanswered. The party closed ranks and treated any criticism of Amoateng as an attack on the NPP itself. The National Democratic Congress, Ghana's main opposition party, called for Amoateng's seat to be declared vacant. The constitutional basis for this demand was straightforward. A member who cannot perform parliamentary duties because he is incarcerated abroad is effectively absent. The seat should be vacated and a by-election held so that constituents have representation. Article 97(1)(g) of Ghana's constitution provides that a member of parliament shall vacate his seat if he is absent from 15 sittings of parliament without permission. Amoateng was not merely absent from 15 sittings, he was in U.S. federal custody facing criminal charges that made his return to Ghana impossible for the foreseeable future. The NDC raised this issue repeatedly in parliamentary sessions. Each time, the NPP majority blocked the motion. Parliamentary procedure in Ghana requires that motions be approved by majority vote. The NPP held the majority and could therefore prevent any motion from passing simply by voting as a bloc. The majority chief whip, Osa Kayemensabonsu, maintained that Amoateng remained a suspect rather than a convicted criminal. Until a conviction was secured, the party argued, the seat could not be vacated. This argument treated criminal prosecution as the only relevant standard for determining parliamentary fitness. It ignored the practical reality that Amoateng could not represent his constituents while imprisoned in the United States. This position was technically accurate but morally hollow. Amoateng was in U.S. custody facing overwhelming evidence. The likelihood of acquittal was negligible. The party's stance was transparently designed to hold the fort, to maintain the NPP's numerical advantage in parliament for as long as possible. Every seat matters in parliamentary systems, especially when the governing coalition's majority is narrow. Losing Amoateng's seat to a by-election that the NDC might win would shift the balance of power. Committee assignments would change. Votes on key legislation would become more competitive. The government's ability to pass its agenda would be compromised. The delay also signaled something more troubling, a reluctance to confront the implications of having elected a drug trafficker to parliament. Acknowledging Amoateng's guilt would raise uncomfortable questions about how he had been vetted, who had supported him, and whether party officials had known about his activities. Senior NPP figures had attended Amoateng's campaign events. They had accepted his donations. They had benefited from his financial support for the party. If he was guilty of drug trafficking, what did that say about the party's judgment and integrity? It was easier to delay confronting these questions by maintaining that he was innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. The standoff continued for more than 10 months. During this period, Amoateng's constituents in Nkoranza North had no functional representative. Parliamentary business proceeded without their voice. Committee work happened without their participation. Votes were cast without their input. The residents of Nkoranza North, many of whom had supported Amoateng enthusiastically, were effectively disenfranchised. They could not recall him. They could not vote for a replacement. They simply had to wait while their elected representative sat in a U.S. detention facility and their political party refused to acknowledge reality. The NPP justified the inaction by pointing to procedural requirements. They claimed that without formal notification from U.S. courts or a conviction recognized under Ghanaian law, Parliament could not act. This was bureaucratic obstruction dressed as legal caution. Ghana's constitution provides clear mechanisms for vacating parliamentary seats. Article 97 lists multiple grounds including absence, mental incapacity, and conduct incompatible with membership. A member imprisoned abroad on drug trafficking charges clearly falls within the spirit, if not the letter, of these provisions. The party chose to interpret the Constitution narrowly to serve its political interests. In January 2007, under mounting public and parliamentary pressure, the Speaker of Parliament, Ebenezer Seki Hughes, finally directed that the issue of Amoateng's absence be addressed formally. The Speaker's intervention broke the logjam. Seki Hughes recognized that the situation had become untenable. Media coverage was intensifying. Civil society organizations were calling for action. The NDC was using the issue to attack the government's credibility. International observers were questioning Ghana's commitment to combating corruption. The directive forced the party to acknowledge what had been obvious for over a year: the seat needed to be vacated. As Ghanaian authorities began examining Amoateng's domestic operations, investigators uncovered connections that reached into the upper levels of government. The Narcotic Controls Board initiated an inquiry into the Kan Dapa Foundation, a charity organization established by Albert Kan Dapa. At the time, Kan Dapa was serving as Ghana's Minister of Energy. The foundation's involvement in the case came to light through a shipping pattern. George Owusu, the individual who had facilitated the ceramic shipments from Dubai to the United States for Amoateng, had also shipped ceramics from the United States to the Kan Dapa Foundation in Ghana. The discovery emerged during NACOB's efforts to map Amoateng's logistics network. Investigators were attempting to identify everyone involved in moving narcotics from source countries through Ghana and onward to consumer markets. They examined shipping records, customs declarations, and financial transactions. George Owusu's name appeared in connection with multiple ceramic shipments. Some of these shipments had gone to Amoateng in the United States and were intercepted by DEA. Others had gone from the United States to the Kan Dapa Foundation in Ghana. The pattern raised immediate suspicion. The ceramics shipped to the foundation were described as donations. Kandapa maintained that the foundation received legitimate charitable contributions including clothing and decorative pottery. The foundation distributed these items to schools, hospitals, and community organizations. Receiving donated goods from abroad is common practice for Ghanaian charities. Diaspora communities and international donors regularly send containers of supplies to support development projects. On its face, the Kandapa Foundation's receipt of ceramic donations appeared routine. Kandapa denied any involvement in trafficking operations. He stated publicly that he had no knowledge of Amoateng's criminal activities and that the foundation's charitable work was entirely legitimate. There was no direct evidence presented publicly that the shipments to the foundation contained narcotics. NACOB investigators did not claim to have found drugs in the foundation's possession. The concern was more subtle. The same facilitator, George Usu, was handling shipments for both Amoateng and a minister's charity. This suggested either a shared logistics network or a concerning overlap in business relationships. If Usu was moving contraband for Amoateng, why was he also arranging shipments for a government minister's foundation? Several explanations were possible. Usu might have been providing legitimate services to the foundation while separately engaging in criminal activity with Amoateng. The foundation might have been unwittingly used as cover, with Usu mixing legitimate and illicit shipments to reduce suspicion. Or the foundation might have been knowingly involved in the trafficking network. NACOB investigators wanted to pursue the lead. The shipment patterns warranted deeper examination. Investigators sought to interview Usu, review all shipping records involving the foundation, examine the foundation's financial records to determine if there were unexplained fund flows, and inspect any donated ceramics still in the foundation's possession. Standard investigative protocol would involve these steps, but the investigation into the Kandapa Foundation was cut short by a political intervention that appeared designed to prevent further exposure. In a sudden cabinet reshuffle, President John Kufuor appointed Albert Kandapa as Minister of the Interior. The appointment was controversial for a specific reason. The Ministry of the Interior oversees NACOB. The Narcotic Controls Board operates under the Ministry of the Interior's jurisdiction. The minister has authority over NACOB's budget, personnel decisions, and operational priorities. By placing Kandapa in charge of the very agency investigating his foundation, the government created an obvious conflict of interest. The timing of the appointment raised further questions. Cabinet reshuffles occur for various reasons: poor ministerial performance, political considerations, the need to balance regional or factional interests within the governing party. But this reshuffle appeared targeted. Kandapa was moved from Energy to Interior precisely when NACOB's investigation was gaining momentum. The move looked like a deliberate effort to shut down the inquiry. Critics argued that no minister should oversee an agency investigating entities connected to him. The conflict was clear. Kandapa's supervision of NACOB created an impossible situation for investigators. If they pursued the foundation inquiry vigorously, they risked antagonizing their superior. If they backed off, they would be failing in their duty to investigate fully. The investigation stalled almost immediately. Several NACOB personnel who had been involved in the case were transferred to other duties or dismissed outright. The official explanations for these personnel changes were vague. Officers were told they were being reassigned for administrative reasons, that their skills were needed elsewhere, or that organizational restructuring required their transfer. But the timing made the intent clear. Investigators who were asking uncomfortable questions about government connections to the Amoateng network were removed from positions where they could continue that work. Former NACOB officials later described an atmosphere of intimidation. Officers understood that pursuing certain leads could end their careers. They received informal warnings from superiors about the political sensitivity of the case. They saw colleagues who pushed too hard get transferred to remote posts or passed over for promotions. The message was unmistakable. There were boundaries to the investigation that should not be crossed. These boundaries protected not just Kandapa but potentially other officials whose connections to Amoateng or to the broader trafficking network might be revealed through thorough investigation. Eric Amoateng was released from U.S. federal custody on July 30, 2014. He had served approximately 9 years of his 10-year sentence. Early release is possible under federal guidelines for good behavior and program participation. Inmates who complete educational programs, maintain disciplinary records free of infractions, and participate in work assignments can accumulate good time credits that reduce their sentences. Amoateng apparently qualified for these reductions. On August 7, 2014, he was deported to Ghana. His arrival at Kotoka International Airport became a media spectacle. Hundreds of supporters and NPP party members gathered to welcome him. They carried banners with messages of support. Some read, "Welcome home and we never forgot you." They sang songs and chanted his name. They brought drums and created a carnival atmosphere. Politicians from the NPP were present, including constituency-level officials and some regional figures. They gave speeches praising Amoateng's resilience and framing his imprisonment as a trial he had endured. The scene captured the enduring loyalty Amoateng commanded in his community and within his party. For his supporters, the years in prison had not diminished his status. If anything, they had reinforced his image as a victim of foreign persecution. The narrative that developed among his base was that Amoateng had been unfairly targeted by American authorities who did not understand African politics or who were hostile to successful Black African politicians. This framing ignored the overwhelming evidence of his guilt and the fairness of his trial. It recast him as a martyr rather than a criminal. The hero's welcome reflected how effectively he had built community loyalty through years of patronage. People remembered the streets he had paved, the schools he had funded, the personal assistance he had provided. Those memories outweighed his criminal conviction. But NACOB officials were also present at the airport. Amoateng was arrested immediately upon arrival for questioning. The dual spectacle supporters celebrating while police arrested him captured the divided reality of his status. He was simultaneously a beloved community figure and a convicted international drug trafficker. The agency stated it wanted to interrogate him about the source of his assets and a new offense that had come to light: possession of a forged passport. The passport in question carried the number H2347080. It had been issued in 2009 while Amoateng was still incarcerated in the United States. This alone was suspicious. A person imprisoned abroad should not be able to obtain a valid travel document from his home country. The passport issuance process requires application, documentation, and verification. How had someone in a U.S. federal prison completed this process? Investigation revealed something more damning. The passport number was identical to one that had been issued to a woman by Ghanaian immigration authorities. Ghana's passport system assigns unique numbers to each document. The duplication of a number is not a clerical error, it indicates fraudulent issuance. Someone within the immigration authority had created a passport for Amoateng using a number already assigned to another person. This required insider access to the passport issuance system. The person creating the document would have needed to bypass security protocols, input false data, and produce a physical passport that appeared authentic. The coordination suggested that Amoateng's network maintained contacts within government agencies even while he was imprisoned. The passport was unambiguously fraudulent. Someone within Ghana's immigration system had produced it while Amoateng was in U.S. custody. The document suggested coordination between Amoateng's network and corrupt officials inside government agencies. Passport fraud is not a trivial offense. It facilitates smuggling, identity theft, and illegal border crossings. For someone with Amoateng's history, a forged passport indicated intent to resume activities that required disguised movement. The document would allow him to travel under a false identity, to cross borders without his real name appearing in immigration databases, and to evade monitoring by law enforcement agencies tracking his movements. NACOB brought charges and the case proceeded to trial in Ghana's High Court. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They presented the passport and documented its fraudulent nature. They showed that the number was duplicated. They demonstrated that Amoateng had used the document to re-enter Ghana. Immigration records showed that he had presented the passport at Kotoka International Airport. Officials had processed him using the fraudulent document. He had passed through customs and border control using credentials that were demonstrably fake. The evidence was clear and the facts were not in serious dispute. Justice Ellen Amo presided. The prosecution presented the passport and the evidence of its fraudulent issuance. They demonstrated that the document bore a number already assigned to another person, and that Amoateng had used it to re-enter Ghana. Forensic examination confirmed that the passport was not an authentic issuance despite bearing official stamps and security features. The prosecution argued that Amoateng's possession and use of the document demonstrated knowledge of its fraudulent nature and intent to deceive immigration authorities. A convicted international trafficker in possession of a forged passport had obvious criminal intent. The defense did not contest that the passport was fake. Instead, they argued that Amoateng had not known it was forged and lacked the specific intent to deceive immigration authorities. The defense claimed he had simply used a document provided to him without verifying its authenticity. This defense requires accepting several implausible propositions: that Amoateng, who had managed sophisticated international logistics for drug trafficking, did not recognize that obtaining a passport while imprisoned was suspicious, that he did not question how the document was produced, that he did not examine it carefully enough to notice any irregularities, and that he had no reason to suspect the people who provided it might be engaged in illegal activity on his behalf. Justice Amo accepted this argument. She ruled that the prosecution had failed to prove Amoateng was aware the passport was forged or that he possessed the necessary intent to deceive. The legal standard for conviction requires proof beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant knew the document was fraudulent. The judge determined that the evidence, while showing the passport was fake, did not conclusively prove Amoateng's knowledge of that fact. The court acquitted him. The ruling meant that he faced no additional punishment for the passport fraud. He was free to leave the courtroom without further legal jeopardy. One of the most glaring failures in the Amoateng case has been the Ghanaian government's inability to confiscate the proceeds of his crimes. NACOB announced publicly that it intended to seize his assets. These included substantial holdings in the Nkoranza district, a 300-hectare maize farm, multiple residential properties in Nkoranza and Accra, and other investments. The maize farm alone was a significant asset. 300 hectares represents a large commercial operation. At typical maize yields in Ghana, such a farm could produce 600 to 900 metric tons annually. Revenue from a farm of this size would be substantial, easily generating tens of thousands of cedis per year. During Amoateng's incarceration, the maize farm was tended by volunteers from his community, a testament to the loyalty his patronage had secured. Local people maintained the farm, planted and harvested crops, managed sales, and presumably turned proceeds over to Amoateng's family. This arrangement ensured the farm remained productive and continued generating income during his absence. The willingness of community members to work the farm for free demonstrated the depth of personal loyalty Amoateng had cultivated. These were not paid employees maintaining an asset. They were supporters who believed they owed him enough to protect his interests while he served time abroad. But more than a decade after his conviction, none of these assets had been confiscated by the state. In 2017, NACOB officials claimed they were unable to proceed with asset forfeiture because they had not received formal details of the U.S. court judgment. This explanation was difficult to accept. The case had been widely publicized. Sentencing details were matters of public record in U.S. federal courts. Court documents are publicly available through the PACER system, which provides electronic access to federal court records. Journalists, researchers, and members of the public had accessed these documents. The suggestion that NACOB, a government law enforcement agency with international liaison relationships, could not obtain basic court documents was not credible. Ghana and the United States maintained cooperative agreements on drug enforcement. The Drug Enforcement Administration had worked directly with Ghanaian authorities during the investigation. DEA agents maintain liaison relationships with NACOB. Information sharing between law enforcement agencies is routine in international narcotics cases. If NACOB had formally requested the sentencing documents through official channels, U.S. authorities would have provided them. The claim that bureaucratic paperwork prevented asset seizure looked like an excuse rather than a legitimate obstacle. Legal experts in Ghana pointed out that the state has domestic legal mechanisms for asset forfeiture that do not require foreign court documents. Under Ghanaian law, assets acquired through criminal activity can be seized if the state demonstrates they were proceeds of crime. The relevant statute is the Organized Crime Act, which includes provisions for civil asset forfeiture. The state must prove on the balance of probabilities that assets are proceeds of unlawful activity. This is a lower standard than the beyond reasonable doubt standard required for criminal conviction. Amoateng's conviction in the United States provided that demonstration. His inability to explain the legitimate source of his wealth, given his modest official employment history, further supported forfeiture. Amoateng had worked as a teacher and a marketing manager for a school supplies company. Neither position generates the kind of wealth required to purchase 300 hectares of farmland and multiple properties. Teachers in Ghana earn modest salaries. Marketing managers in the private sector earn more but still within a limited range. There is no plausible scenario in which legitimate income from these positions could have funded Amoateng's asset accumulation. The disproportion between his known income and his assets was so stark that it constituted prima facie evidence of illicit sourcing. Yet no action was taken. NACOB made more progress on assets belonging to Nih Akai Ajay, Amoateng's co-defendant. Some of Ajay's holdings were identified and subjected to legal proceedings. The state initiated forfeiture actions against properties that Ajay owned or controlled. These proceedings were slow and faced legal challenges, but at least they were initiated. But Ajay lacked Amoateng's political connections and community base. He was a facilitator rather than a principal. He had no traditional authority, no parliamentary history, no network of supporters who would defend him. The state's ability to move against Ajay while failing to act on Amoateng reinforced the perception that political protection was decisive. The contrast was stark. Two men convicted of the same crime in the same case faced dramatically different outcomes regarding asset forfeiture. The one with political connections kept his assets. The one without lost his. This disparity signals to other potential traffickers that political investment pays dividends. Building a base of community support, securing a position within a major political party, and establishing traditional authority creates protections that survive criminal conviction. The lesson is not that crime doesn't pay, it's that crime combined with political entrenchment allows you to keep what you've earned through crime. The Amoateng case is not isolated. It fits within a broader pattern of narco-trafficking that has transformed parts of West Africa into critical transit zones for drugs moving from production areas in Asia and South America to consumer markets in North America and Europe. The region's attractiveness to traffickers rests on several structural factors: porous borders, limited law enforcement capacity, high poverty rates, and the presence of political figures willing to provide protection in exchange for financial gain. West Africa's geography makes it strategically valuable. The region sits along maritime and air routes connecting South America's cocaine-producing countries with European markets. It also lies along routes connecting Asian heroin-producing regions with North American markets. Traffickers exploit this positioning by routing drugs through West African countries to obscure their origin and destination. A shipment of cocaine traveling directly from Colombia to Spain faces intensive monitoring. The same shipment routed through Guinea-Bissau or Ghana attracts less scrutiny because the routing appears to involve legitimate African commerce rather than direct drug trafficking. The region's borders are porous. Many West African countries share long land borders that pass through remote areas with minimal government presence. Border posts are understaffed and equipped with limited technology. Customs officials often lack training in drug detection. Corruption is endemic, with traffickers able to bribe officials to allow shipments through. Maritime borders are even more vulnerable. West Africa's coastline stretches thousands of kilometers with countless small ports, fishing villages, and unmonitored beaches where drugs can be landed. Coast guards are under-resourced and cannot patrol effectively. Traffickers use small boats to offload drugs from larger vessels offshore, bringing them ashore at isolated locations. Law enforcement capacity is limited. Police and customs agencies face chronic underfunding. Salaries are low, creating incentives for corruption. Equipment is outdated or non-existent. Many border posts lack basic scanning technology. Forensic laboratories capable of testing seized substances are scarce. Officers receive minimal training in investigative techniques. Interagency cooperation is weak, with police, customs, and intelligence services failing to share information effectively. These capacity limitations make West Africa an attractive operational environment for traffickers who can overwhelm local enforcement through volume, bribery, or intimidation. High poverty rates create vulnerability. In regions where formal employment opportunities are scarce and incomes are low, the money offered by trafficking organizations is transformative. A fisherman earning a few dollars a day can be recruited to transport drugs for hundreds or thousands of dollars. A customs official earning a government salary can be bribed with amounts that represent years of legitimate income. Young men without economic prospects can be recruited as couriers, guards, or facilitators. Poverty doesn't cause drug trafficking, but it creates a population that is susceptible to recruitment by criminal organizations offering financial rewards that legitimate economies cannot match. During the period of Amoateng's peak activity, cocaine and heroin prices in Ghana remained relatively stable. This stability suggested that supply chains were efficient and well-established. Trafficking operations were not being disrupted by law enforcement. The drugs flowed through the region with minimal interdiction. Price stability is an indicator of market efficiency. If law enforcement were regularly seizing large shipments, prices would spike due to supply constraints. If trafficking routes were being disrupted, prices would fluctuate as traffickers sought alternative pathways. The absence of price volatility indicated that the flow of drugs through West Africa was steady and reliable. The volume passing through West Africa was substantial. Estimates from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime suggested that dozens of metric tons of cocaine were transiting the region annually during the 2000s. For heroin, the volumes were smaller but still significant. These quantities represented street values in the hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars. The money generated by this trade was enormous relative to the legitimate economies of West African countries. In some cases, drug money flowing through a country exceeded the government's annual budget. This created an inverted power structure where traffickers had more resources than local governments. The involvement of a sitting member of parliament indicated that cartels had moved beyond bribing low-level customs officials. They were participating directly in legislative processes. Low-level corruption is common in many countries: port workers paid to look the other way, police officers bribed to avoid making arrests, customs officials who process shipments without thorough inspection. But Amoateng's case demonstrated a qualitative escalation. Traffickers were not merely paying off officials, they were becoming officials. By securing parliamentary seats, they gained access to diplomatic protections, influenced law enforcement budgets and priorities, participated in drafting laws that governed drug enforcement, and legitimized themselves through electoral mandates. Amoateng's case demonstrated how a trafficker could use political office not just as cover, but as operational infrastructure. His parliamentary status gave him access to diplomatic channels that facilitated international travel. It provided legal protections that made investigation more difficult. It gave him influence over the very agencies tasked with investigating drug crimes. He could use parliamentary privilege to deflect scrutiny, to question why he was being targeted, to suggest that investigations were politically motivated. He had a platform to shape public narratives. He could grant interviews, make speeches, and use media access to defend himself and attack his accusers. This level of state capture represents a qualitative escalation in the threat posed by organized crime to governance institutions. When traffickers hold legislative seats, they can shape laws to serve their interests. They can weaken enforcement provisions, reduce penalties, cut budgets for anti-narcotics agencies, and create loopholes that facilitate trafficking. They can block reforms that would improve enforcement capacity. They can protect allies and enablers within the bureaucracy. The corruption becomes systemic rather than episodic. It's not a matter of paying bribes to individual officials, it's a matter of controlling institutional structures. Academic research on this phenomenon uses the term big man syndrome to describe the role that politically connected patrons play in facilitating trafficking. The big man provides political cover and logistical support. In return, he receives financial backing that allows him to maintain his patronage networks and political power. The relationship is symbiotic. The trafficker needs the politician's protection. Access to diplomatic channels reduces risk. Political influence prevents aggressive investigation. The politician needs the trafficker's money. Electoral campaigns are expensive. Patronage networks require constant financial input. Legitimate sources of wealth are limited. Drug money solves the resource problem. Both benefit from weak institutions that cannot effectively investigate or prosecute the arrangement. Strong, independent law enforcement agencies would detect the relationship and disrupt it. Courts that function impartially would convict both parties. Media that investigates freely would expose the connections. But in environments where institutions are weak, captured, or intimidated, the relationship flourishes. The big man and the trafficker protect each other. The big man uses political power to shield the trafficker from law enforcement. The trafficker uses financial power to keep the big man in office and to fund the patronage networks that maintain his political base. The cycle is self-reinforcing. Amoateng exemplified this model. His philanthropy was funded by trafficking proceeds. His political power protected the trafficking operation. International law enforcement agencies have documented similar patterns across the region. Guinea-Bissau experienced a period where military officials were directly involved in cocaine trafficking, leading some analysts to describe it as a narco-state. Senior military officers facilitated the landing of drug flights from South America. They provided security for drug shipments. They used military infrastructure to store and move cocaine. The profits were so substantial that the drug traffickers could pay officers amounts that dwarfed their official salaries. When government reformers attempted to investigate, they faced threats and violence. Some were forced to flee the country. The military's involvement in trafficking became so entrenched that removing it would have required dismantling the security apparatus itself. In Mali, trafficking networks exploited political instability and porous borders to move drugs north toward European markets. The country's vast Sahara territories are largely ungoverned. Traffickers used these spaces to move drugs through desert routes that avoided major population centers and border posts. They bribed or coerced local authorities in isolated communities. The collapse of government authority in northern Mali during periods of rebellion created opportunities for trafficking organizations to operate with even greater freedom. Groups involved in rebellion and terrorism formed alliances with traffickers, providing security in exchange for funding. The links between organized crime, political instability, and violent extremism became deeply entangled. In Nigeria, complex criminal organizations operated with varying degrees of official complicity. The country's size, economic importance, and large diaspora population made it an attractive operational base. Nigerian trafficking organizations developed international networks moving heroin, cocaine, and other drugs to markets worldwide. Some officials facilitated operations through corruption. Investigations into high-level involvement faced political obstacles. Whistleblowers were threatened. Cases against politically connected suspects stalled in courts. The scale of trafficking and the depth of official involvement varied by region and by period, but the pattern of state capture was evident. West Africa's geographic position, situated between drug production zones and major consumer markets, made it strategically valuable for traffickers seeking routes that avoided heavily monitored pathways through Latin America or the Caribbean. Law enforcement in North America and Europe focused intense attention on traditional trafficking routes. Caribbean islands faced pressure to improve interdiction. Maritime routes through the Caribbean were surveilled by U.S. Coast Guard and DEA aircraft. Traffickers sought alternative pathways that faced less scrutiny. West Africa offered that alternative. Routing drugs through African countries meant they would arrive in Europe or North America, appearing to originate from Africa rather than from South America or Asia. This obscured the trafficking chain and made enforcement more difficult. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime has identified West Africa as a region where the volume of drug money flowing through certain countries represents a significant percentage of GDP. In small countries with limited formal economies, even modest volumes of drug money create macroeconomic effects. When criminal capital reaches this scale, it distorts currency markets. Large inflows of US dollars or euros from drug sales create demand for local currency as traffickers convert proceeds. This can affect exchange rates. It influences election outcomes because candidates funded by drug money can outspend legitimate rivals. It corrupts procurement processes as drug-funded officials award contracts to allies. Eric Amoateng's trajectory from traditional chief to member of parliament to convicted international heroin trafficker and back to relative impunity in Ghana illustrates the resilience of narco-patrimonial systems. The U.S. investigation and prosecution represented a significant victory for international law enforcement. It demonstrated that even politically connected traffickers could be held accountable when they operated in jurisdictions with strong institutions. The DEA and ICE conducted sophisticated surveillance. U.S. prosecutors built an overwhelming case. Federal courts rejected immunity claims and imposed substantial sentences. The message was clear: drug trafficking would not be tolerated regardless of the offender's status. But the domestic aftermath revealed how difficult it is to dismantle these networks when the home country's institutions are compromised. Amoateng returned to Ghana and was acquitted of passport fraud on narrow legal grounds. His assets remain unconsolidated more than a decade after his conviction. He retained community support despite overwhelming evidence of his crimes. The political party that nominated him never formally repudiated him. He remained a member in good standing. Party officials attended his welcome ceremony. No internal investigation examined how he had been vetted or whether others knew of his activities. The agencies tasked with investigating his network were hindered or obstructed when their inquiries threatened powerful figures. NACOB's investigation into the Can-Dapa Foundation was shut down. Personnel were transferred. The minister implicated was promoted to oversee the investigating agency. Asset forfeiture proceedings stalled. Excuses about missing paperwork were offered despite the documents being publicly available. The system that allowed him to operate for years remained fundamentally unchanged. The lesson drawn by other would-be traffickers was clear: if you build sufficient political capital through patronage, you can survive exposure and prosecution in foreign courts. Domestic consequences can be managed through party loyalty, community support, and institutional manipulation. Amoateng spent 10 years in a U.S. federal prison, but he returned to his farm, his properties, his community support, and his political connections. From his perspective, the cost was bearable given that he retained the proceeds of his crimes. The failure to confiscate Amoateng's assets is particularly significant. Asset forfeiture is the mechanism through which states disrupt the economic logic of organized crime. Traffickers calculate risk versus reward. Amoateng faced the risk: arrest, prosecution, conviction, 10 years in prison. But he kept the reward: the farm, the properties, the wealth accumulated through trafficking. If the reward remains accessible, the risk of imprisonment becomes a manageable cost of doing business. Imprisoning traffickers without seizing their assets is like fining a billionaire 1% of his wealth. It's an inconvenience rather than a deterrent. By contrast, if assets are seized and criminal proceeds are permanently removed, the enterprise becomes unprofitable. The trafficker serves his sentence and emerges with nothing. The years in prison have destroyed his wealth rather than merely interrupting his access to it. This changes the calculation fundamentally. The risk produces no reward. The suffering in prison is not compensated by future prosperity. This is true deterrence. Ghana's inability or unwillingness to execute this step meant that Amoateng's criminal enterprise retained its economic foundation. He served his time in the United States and returned to wealth. For someone in his position, that outcome might have seemed acceptable. 10 years is a long time, but he was only in his early 50s when arrested. He served his sentence and returned home while still young enough to enjoy his wealth and perhaps rebuild his operations. Had his assets been seized, the calculation would be different. He would have lost those 10 years and emerged with nothing. The deterrent effect would be far stronger. The case also underscored the need for greater independence in anti-narcotics agencies. NACOB's investigation into the Can-Dapa Foundation was shut down when the subject of the inquiry was appointed to oversee the investigating agency. This type of institutional capture makes effective law enforcement impossible. Agencies require statutory independence, secure funding, and legal protections for personnel investigating politically sensitive cases. Without these safeguards, investigators face career consequences for pursuing leads that implicate powerful figures. The organizational structure matters. If NACOB reports to the Ministry of Interior and the minister can hire, fire, transfer, and promote NACOB personnel, the agency is not truly independent. It is subordinate to political authority. When political authority is itself implicated in crime, the system cannot self-correct. Institutional independence requires more than formal statements, it requires actual structural protections. Agency heads should serve fixed terms and be removable only for cause through clear procedures. Personnel decisions should be insulated from political interference. Budgets should be protected to prevent defunding as punishment for aggressive investigation. The result is selective enforcement where low-level offenders are prosecuted while high-level enablers remain protected. NACOB can arrest street dealers, small-time smugglers, and couriers. These prosecutions generate statistics that suggest the agency is active, but they don't disrupt the underlying networks. The big fish, the financiers, the political facilitators, the corrupt officials who make large-scale trafficking possible, remain untouchable. This selective enforcement is worse than no enforcement at all because it creates the appearance of action while leaving the core problem intact. International cooperation is essential but insufficient. The United States had the capacity to investigate, arrest, prosecute, and imprison Amoateng, but it could not force Ghana to confiscate his domestic assets or prevent his return to political and social influence. U.S. courts cannot seize property located in Ghana. U.S. law enforcement cannot arrest Amoateng in Ghana for crimes he committed there. The reach of U.S. jurisdiction ends at its borders. Cross-border narcotics cases require sustained cooperation not just during investigation and prosecution, but through the asset recovery phase. Mutual legal assistance treaties exist to facilitate this. Ghana and the United States have agreements that should enable sharing of evidence, coordination of prosecutions, and mutual assistance in asset forfeiture. But these treaties are only effective if both parties execute their obligations. Ghana's failure to seize Amoateng's assets suggests that political will, not legal frameworks, was the limiting factor. The treaties provided the mechanism. What was lacking was the commitment to use it. Asset recovery in international cases is particularly challenging. The prosecuting country identifies assets but cannot seize them if they are located abroad. The asset-holding country must initiate domestic proceedings to forfeit the assets under its own laws. This requires that the asset-holding country's institutions are functional and willing. When those institutions are compromised by the same corruption that enabled the trafficking, asset recovery becomes nearly impossible. Ghana's government would have to move against one of its own MPs, seize assets from a community patron, antagonize party supporters, and acknowledge that its systems had been penetrated by organized crime. The political costs appeared too high. The phenomenon Amoateng represents, the Father Christmas MP who uses criminal proceeds to buy loyalty and institutional protection, poses a fundamental challenge to democratic governance in West Africa. Elections are supposed to create accountability. Representatives are supposed to serve public interests. But when candidates finance campaigns with drug money and govern as patrons dispensing benefits to loyal supporters, the democratic mechanism is corrupted at its foundation. Voters may rationally support candidates who deliver services even if those services are funded by crime. If candidate A promises good governance but delivers nothing and candidate B is a criminal but paves streets and funds schools, voters face a difficult choice. The abstract principle of clean government versus the concrete reality of improved infrastructure. For a family whose children can now attend school in a building Amoateng funded, his criminal conviction in America seems remote and irrelevant. The school is real. The conviction is a foreign court's judgment about activities that most constituents never saw. This creates a constituency that defends criminals because the criminals have delivered benefits that legitimate government has not. The state's failure to provide basic infrastructure creates the opening that narco-politicians exploit. If Ghana's government reliably delivered roads, schools, drainage systems, and lighting, Amoateng's patronage would be less valuable. Communities would have their needs met through legitimate channels and would be less dependent on criminal benefactors. But Ghana, like many developing countries, struggles to deliver services to rural areas. Budgets are limited, corruption siphons funds, capacity is weak, projects stall, communities wait years for promised improvements that never arrive. Into this vacuum step figures like Amoateng who can deliver immediately because they have access to criminal capital.